Yeah, please go ahead. So,
we can go live now. You
can start.
Okay, sir.
Yes, Arya.
Good evening to one and all. So I'm going to take this opportunity to welcome Ms. Sophia Carlton to this webinar series that is conducted by the MBA department at National Forensic Sciences University. Before we move on to the whole session and Ms. Sophia takes over, I would like to say a few words about Ms. Sophia Carlton and introduce her to our audience. So, Ms. Sophia Carlton is a CFA certified fraud examiner who has begun her career at Grant Thornton as an associate, and in the span of a very limited time, she has moved her ranks up to the manager level, and she is right now a manager at the fraud department that is there in Grant Thornton in situated in the US. And about Sophia, I would like to say that she has also authored certain publications that are there in the anti-fraud playbooks that were published by the ACFE, one of them, as well as the Department of Treasury and Chief Financial Officers Council. Having a span of more than 6+ years in helping her clientele, which is not just limited to the corporates, but also the government side, that is the public sector as well. She has also helped several agencies that spread from federal agencies to the Fortune 100 to 500 countries as well. Her immense knowledge in fraud risk assessment is not just limited to fraud risk management, but also about anti-fraud strategies as well as various other parts of this particular field as well. She has helped all her clients to tackle up such tough fraud challenges that happen in today's world. And I think she is apt for, being the speaker of this particular webinar to give our students a practical knowledge at this point in this particular field. And to say, rightly quoted by Harish sir, that this is one of a kind webinar that has not been done yet in National Forensic Sciences University, wherein the students will learn about fraud risk management. So I think now it's time for me to give the space to Ms. Sophia Carlton, who will take forward the session. I welcome
Thank
you,
you
ma'am.
so much. Thank you. I appreciate such a warm introduction. Let me go ahead and share the presentation for today, and we will get started. So I'm really excited to be here and to talk to you all about fraud risk assessment. So in my introduction, you heard a little bit of that, right? So I primarily focus in fraud risk management and that proactive side of fraud risk management. And it sounds like you guys had a lot of presentations on forensic accounting, and generally we think of that as the reactive side of fraud risk management, right? So when a fraud event has happened, how can we leverage our skill set to figure out what happened, right? And where the money went or the information went or whatever it may be. And so this is really where I focus and I enjoy it. I conduct fraud risk assessments all the time. It's an area I'm really passionate about. And I certainly welcome questions, and I will answer everything to the best of my ability. Also, if you ever want to reach out or contact me, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can also email me or find me on Twitter. That's my Twitter handle. I'd be happy to connect with anyone after the session. So when thinking about fraud risk assessment, I always like to start with the idea of the iceberg. So when we think about fraud, due to the deceptive nature of fraud, we don't know the depth of it, right? We don't know a fraud is happening until we identify it, and we may never identify it. And so the fraud we know about is generally what I refer to as the tip of the iceberg. It's what we see above the surface. But there is this potential for all these submerged or unknown frauds that are lurking beneath the surface. And the goal of fraud risk assessment is to help organizations uncover more and more of that iceberg through brainstorming potential fraud risks that we don't know about, right? And then implementing mitigating strategies to prevent and detect those new and emerging risks. And so throughout the presentation today, I'll keep referring back to this iceberg and this concept of how do we uncover more of those submerged frauds beneath the surface through proactive fraud risk assessment. And when we think about fraud risk assessment, so fraud risk assessment, from my perspective, should be used as a dynamic tool, right? It's not a one and done exercise. It shouldn't be completed to check the box or for a compliance activity, because you won't gain all of the benefit that you could if you approached it as a tool to help you understand where your organization is vulnerable and how to take control, right? How do we start to combat those risks effectively rather than trying to, take a shot in the dark, right? Where we think we may have risk, but we're not totally sure. Fraud risk assessment can help provide clarity and ensure that an organization is taking an informed approach to risk response. And every organization has different risks. Even organizations in the same industries face different risks because of the way they operate, right? Their controlled environment, because of how mature their data analytics programs may be, right? So there's all of these factors that will impact the type and the level of risk that an organization faces, even amongst peer organizations. And so it's important to approach fraud risk assessment like an art, not a science, right? And there's certainly science behind it, right? We certainly want to approach it logically, but we need to make sure that we are tailoring our approach and it's nuanced enough to actually reflect the unique fraud risk landscape of the organization that we're looking at. And thinking of when to perform a fraud risk assessment. So like I mentioned, right, it's not a one and done activity. It's something that needs to be reconducted both on a periodic and an ad hoc basis. So what do we mean by periodic? So periodic would be an annual assessment, right? Or maybe for a lower risk area every 2 years. And when we think of ad hoc, right, think of what's been happening over the last few years, right? A global pandemic. That changes the fraud risk landscape and should require or initiate an ad hoc assessment of, okay, now that this is happening, how does that impact our fraud risk landscape? Other types of things that may initiate or trigger an ad hoc assessment can be establishing a new business line, a new program, starting a new project, right? Changing in your control environment, a major restructuring or reorganization, and changes in laws, regulations, or policies, right? And so you see periodic refresh is just one of these bullets here, and there's a lot of reasons why you may need to do an ad hoc assessment. And in my experience, that's where a lot of organizations have pitfalls, because they'll have something in place for every year, but fraud is constantly changing and it's constantly evolving. So if you wait a whole year to think about it again, right, you could already be that bottom of your iceberg, right, under the surface is getting bigger and bigger and bigger while you're not focused on it. And so it's important to have that process for an ad hoc assessment. What that looks like in practice, right, can be a little bit different. So one of the things that I always recommend for an ad hoc assessment is to focus on brainstorming sessions, right? So we have this maybe a major restructuring happening in our organization. Let's think through the fraud risk impact of that, right? Is that restructuring leading to different team structures and roles? How may those individuals then perpetrate internal fraud differently now? Or are we, providing our clients different services for this restructuring, right? How may that impact our fraud risk landscape? And having that kind of cross-functional discussion to help think through how our fraud risk landscape has changed. And so, benefits of fraud risk assessment, and I'm probably biased since this is something I do all the time, but I think there's a plethora of benefits. We have a few of them listed here, and these are really if you're trying to figure out how do we justify resources for an assessment, right? How do we make sure that the organization that I'm working for or I'm working with really sees the value here? And there's just a few here, but I say it's exponential, right? So one of the things that's not on this list is a fraud risk assessment helps you learn a whole lot about an organization outside of fraud, right? So I worked with organizations where we identified control inefficiencies, where we identified areas where things were not happening in line with policy. I remember we were conducting a cross-functional fraud risk workshop, and one of the frontline staff, we were talking about a particular control, and that staff member said, "Oh, but we never do that. Right? We don't follow that part of the process." And leadership over that area was dumbfounded, right? They really thought that people were doing it. And it was just this big divide from what's written down versus reality. And there were a lot of good reasons why the frontline staff weren't doing that leadership wasn't aware of. And so it identified this break from policy versus practice. And it also helped identify a potential area for enhancement. The control wasn't working, that's why they weren't performing it. right? So that's just a benefit of fraud risk assessment that I think a lot of people don't think about, is through conversations with people and through really looking at all different parts of the organization, you're able to identify so many things because it's really a comprehensive assessment of that current state of the organization. And so moving on, that's really a kind of an introduction, laying the foundation. Now we're going to talk the rest of the time about how to conduct a fraud risk assessment and what are those steps that you can follow to conduct a best-in-class fraud risk assessment. And so at a high level, this is how I bucketed the steps. I would say, like I mentioned earlier, right, fraud risk assessment's an art, not a science. So these may differ, but I think at their core, these are the 4 things that will happen, right? First, you need to identify your fraud risks. Then you need to assess those risks, right? Prioritize and respond to the assessed risks, and then document and report the results, right? So it follows a pretty logical succession of steps here, and we'll talk about each of these steps in more detail. So first, kicking off with the identification of fraud risks. Before we get into that, I did want to provide another foundational piece of information, right? Fraud versus fraud risk. So based on the focus on forensic science, right, and forensic accounting, and we sometimes get focused on this idea of fraud, right? And fraud generally denotes an event that has been investigated and successfully prosecuted, right, with intent. And fraud risk is where we're focused for fraud risk assessment. And so that's what we're talking about today. And that's really the vulnerability that an organization faces from individuals internal or external to the organization, right? So it's that vulnerability to fraud based on their control and operating environment, based on their industry, right? Based on how they're structured, right? Based on a lot of different factors. And so another kind of goal of fraud risk assessment is we're aiming for fraud prevention rather than crisis cleanup, right? So how can we proactively identify, assess, and mitigate fraud risks before it becomes a headline? And so thinking through that, right, how do we tackle that first step of identifying fraud risks? And so I like to call it thinking like a fraudster, right? So put your fraudster cap on and start brainstorming fraud risks. And that sounds simple. It can be a little difficult, especially for stakeholders that you may work with who don't have a strong background in fraud or even risk. And so it's important to also bake in a little bit of stakeholder education and training as part of this process. But this is where you say, okay, our expense reimbursement process, right? Let's focus on that. That's a process that almost every organization has. We have to start from when someone submits an expense reimbursement, right? What are the controls and processes in place between that submission to expense payout? Right? And then where do we think there may be gaps or vulnerabilities in that process? And what potential fraud risks are there? When we think of expense reimbursement, right, there's several very tried and true ones that you can easily find on, online free sources, right? There's mischaracterized expenses, there's personal expenses, there's overstated and fictitious expenses. All of these would be laid out as well in the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners fraud tree. So that gets me into another good point is you don't have to start from scratch, right? There's a lot of great tools and resources out there, especially around common occupational or internal fraud risks that you can use as a starting place. And then it's important to then tailor those kind of standard taxonomies or risk hierarchies for your own organization. I would say that external fraud can be a little bit trickier, right? Because external fraud, when we're thinking about what kinds of risks we may have, there is not one easy fraud tree like there is for occupational fraud. External fraud can be difficult because it really depends on the types of external parties that an organization interacts with, right? Do you have vendors, right? Customers, maybe beneficiaries if it's a government program? What other kinds of stakeholders may interact with the program who could then steal assets, right? Whether that's cash assets or non-cash assets. And we also think about in this day and age, people totally unrelated to the organization, right? Think ransomware or just a bad actor who hacks into the system to steal information and sell it on the dark web. So it's important to be holistic in our thinking, leverage available resources, and do this as a group because more minds are better than one when we're going through that process of brainstorming potential fraud risks. And so all of this leads us to a fraud risk map. A fraud risk map is essentially a risk listing of here are the significant fraud risks we identified. And we'll get an example of this later, and we'll get into more details as well on what should your fraud risk map include. So here we have a checklist, right? How do we get from point A to point B in terms of developing an effective and holistic fraud risk map, right? And I'm intentionally trying to avoid the word comprehensive because we do want it to be a comprehensive fraud risk map, but we don't want organizations to have 5,000 fraud risks identified, for example. So when we think of comprehensive, we're more so thinking, is it inclusive of all of our most significant risks or the risks that we feel are most relevant, right? So that way we don't get paralyzed through that analysis, right? That we can leverage our map as something that we can use for decision making and true risk assessment and mitigation. And when the risk listing gets too long, that gets a lot more difficult and unmanageable. So definitely keep that in mind when working with your clients or developing one for your organizations as well as you all move into organizations after schooling. So in terms of checklists, so first, how do you want to break out your fraud risk map, right? So that the organization is broken out by department, by business line, by business function, by program, right? You have to understand that organizational structure, and it's important to then build your map to reflect that structure. And so here's where also if the organization has an internal audit function, an enterprise risk management program, cybersecurity program, right? How do they approach and think about the organizational structure of the organization? Because you can map your fraud risk map in that same approach, and that way the fraud schemes can then be integrated upwards into other efforts and risk management functions that are already present at your organization. And then secondly, develop your fraud risk map framework. This gets to a fraud taxonomy or hierarchy, right? So it's a classification system for fraud risk. So we can have fraud category, fraud scheme, sub-scheme, super sub-scheme, right? Whatever that may look like and how much detail you want in your map. It's important to set that foundation to make sure that everyone is speaking the same language. I worked with an organization where their US group and their Europe group had totally different fraud classification systems, which meant that they could never get an aggregate view between those two groups on fraud risk, right? They had, and even fraud risk losses, they could not aggregate because they were talking about fraud so differently. So it's important both for the fraud risk map, but it also helps lay the foundation for fraud risk management in its totality and fraud loss management and metrics. Then, like we talked about, identify those internal and external schemes, right? What are those schemes for each of those departments, business functions, etc., right? Whatever that may be at the organization. Integrate that all into a map, right? Sometimes we use something as simple as Excel, right? Excel, we have one tab for each of the departments in the organization. And there may be overlap, right? So maybe we have a tab that's all occupational fraud because that's pretty consistent across the board. And then unique external risks for different areas. And some areas may not have external risks depending on their control and operating environment or their function at the organization. And then an important piece, periodically refresh and iterate, right? We talked about that a few slides ago. How do we make sure that the fraud risk assessment doesn't go stale, right? That it stays relevant. And it's important to do this for the fraud risk map. The fraud risk map is an output of a fraud risk assessment, and it too needs to be periodically refreshed and updated to ensure that it still reflects your fraud risk landscape. And so at a high level, that's our checklist, right? And here's an example of a very simple fraud risk map laid out in Excel. And you can see we have business unit, and then we have internal or external fraud tags. And then basically from general fraud category all the way to sub-fraud scheme, that's our classification system. Right, so you can see in this case, we're focused on asset misappropriation, fraudulent disbursements. We have a mix of payroll and expense reimbursement schemes, different types of sub-schemes. And here we've also identified actor and fraud risk entry point. So actor is who is perpetrating the risk, and fraud risk entry point is what is the mechanism or the process that they are taking advantage of to perpetrate that risk. Right, so in the case of a payroll fraud, payroll records would be that entry point. And that helps you think through, right, what about the payroll records makes it vulnerable, right? How might someone access this, and what controls or mechanisms are in place to stop this from happening? So it just helps with the control identification and assessment process. Then we have the risk itself and related control activities, right? And so as this is expanded, you could start to include more and more information if you wanted, right? I've worked with organizations where they've included likelihood and impact for each risk, or control effectiveness if the organization's already assessed the effectiveness of these controls. But this is a great start, right? It's better to have something start somewhere, right, than wait, because this already provides a useful jumping off point for discussion. And so when we think about that in controls, right, it's important to link risk and controls. And that's also a part that sometimes gets lost at organizations. So we always, whenever I'm working on a fraud risk assessment and developing a tailored methodology for a client, we always have to talk about, we've identified these inherent fraud risks, right? So pre-control risks. What are the controls in place, right? We need documentation, we need to talk to people. We need to understand what those controls are so that we can then get to what are your top residual or considering control risks. We'll talk about those terms in a little more detail as well. But it's just important to remember that control activities are a major part of fraud risk assessment. So make sure you don't lose that. So I wanted to make sure we covered this as well. I remember adding this slide in late yesterday. I was like, you know what, I don't have a slide for this yet. And I wanted to reconnect us back to the iceberg. So why, when we think about fraud risk identification, do we go beyond the fraud we already know is happening, right? Because we could easily look at known fraud losses and catalog what those fraud events were. And that would be a great fraud risk map, right? But it's important to go beyond those known fraud events, because getting back again to that deceptive nature of fraud means that we don't have the whole story, right? So those known fraud events, again, are that tip of the iceberg, and there is this potential for all these submerged or unknown frauds beneath the surface. So we need to think outside of the box when we're brainstorming fraud risks, rather than focusing on only the fraud we've seen before, right? So whenever working with a client, we always end up having this conversation, because clients always want to just focus on, well, this is what we know has happened, and we really don't think that that idea you came up with would ever happen here. It's like, well, some of the things have happened you didn't expect until you found it, right? Accidentally. And so it's important to make sure we do take steps, even if it seems outrageous at the time, to understand what those potential risks are, and if there are proper mitigating strategies in place to help prevent or detect them. Okay. And with that, we are on to our next step. So we've identified fraud risks, right? We've brainstormed, we've developed our fraud risk map, we have that taxonomy in place, we're feeling really good about it. So now we take those risks and we assess them. And the way we assess fraud risks can be a combination of different techniques. So we generally recommend an approach of qualitative and quantitative techniques. And what I mean by that is whenever I'm working with a client, we leverage qualitative techniques to understand the current state. Right, so it can be interviews, workshops, focus groups, surveys, and we combine that generally with quantitative data analysis. So that gets to, right, the fraud we know has happened, or control effectiveness ratings, or results of other fraud risk or general risk assessments. So kind of combining those discussions with the data points and then marrying the two to ensure that we have that holistic picture of the control and operating environment and the fraud risk landscape. So we're going to talk mostly about qualitative techniques today. So when we think about these different techniques, right, the goal of these is to understand in more depth the different processes in place and the strength of controls within those processes, all mapped back to those risks that we identified in the first step. So this is where we can start filling in, right, that last column in our fraud risk map example. And so there's different uses for each of these different types of qualitative risk assessment techniques. So I would generally recommend interviews for senior leadership, or when you need to solicit input in a targeted session. Surveys are great in early stages of risk assessment, but you should always follow up through interviews or workshops for a deeper analysis and to help validate or provide additional context to the survey results. And then workshops, appropriate when gathering cross-functional groups to break down silos and really focus on how processes, risks, and controls all interrelate. So my kind of favorite combination of these is I like to really focus on interviews in the beginning, so to get an understanding of each of those in-scope areas, right? So if it's departments, and maybe there's 10 departments at the organization, have an interview with key stakeholders from each of those departments to understand just the current state, right? What do you do and how do you do it? And then follow up with workshops. So now that we know what you do and how you do it, and we've taken time to compare that to the risks, this is where we see your risk. What do you think, right? Let's talk about that. Are those the risks that you see? Are there any gaps in our information? How would you recommend tackling these identified risks then based on your current resources that you have available, both in the short and the long term, right? So it's a great way to take what you learn in a targeted session and then bring it to a broader group, again, to add more context, more detail, and dive a little bit deeper. Surveys can also be really effective. Whenever we conduct a survey, I always make sure that we add some flavor of anti-fraud culture questions. Because if you're going to do a survey, it's a great way to then solicit input on an employee's perspective on anti-fraud culture, right? So that can be the culture of, do they feel comfortable blowing the whistle? Do they fear retaliation? Do their supervisors help perpetrate like a culture of ethical behavior? What about the tone at the top, right? So it's good to ask those in surveys because people feel a lot more comfortable doing that than talking about in a group with their supervisors and their peers right there, and even sometimes their top leadership in the same room. So if you're gonna do a survey, I definitely recommend also integrating some questions on anti-fraud culture, because as you know, anti-fraud culture is a core component of fraud risk management, right? Without culture, without employees calling in tips or third parties calling in tips, right, then we're gonna lose out on a lot of fraud identification. And that's because tips have consistently been the #1 way that fraud is identified for years. So if our culture is not working, that tip, those hotlines may not be as effective, and then we're missing out on the value of that. And so it's important, right, when I talked about how I would use these, the key here is you need to use more than one, right? So surveys, I work with a lot of organizations who historically relied only on surveys. And you get a lot of people who, for example, if you use a survey to rate risks, you get a lot of medium risks. Some people rate it really high, some people rate it really low, right? And some people are not even involved in processes related to that risk, so they have no idea. And you get a lot of mediums that way. And so it's important that we don't rely solely on a survey, but we do follow up with deeper analysis to make sure we get a clear picture. And at the end of the day, as long as you're using more than one of these, then you're leveraging qualitative risk assessment techniques effectively. And so when we think of fraud risk scoring, so some traditional ways that they're scored would be likelihood and impact. So impact is the extent to which a risk event might affect the enterprise, both financial and reputational. And I've seen organizations who have like a 10-point scale for impact, right, with financial, reputational, regulatory, right, all different types of ways to think about impact. So that is also another consideration, and we'll talk about that. How complex should the scales be? And likelihood, the possibility that the event will occur, taking into consideration the controls or mitigating activities in place. So here you'll see we have two scales, right? Likelihood and impact, 1 through 5. So 1 through 5 is a pretty good scale. It helps provide a little bit more nuance than 1 through 3, right? Because 1 through 3, you might get a lot of 2s. 1 through 5, you might get a little bit more differentiation between different risks. The key here, though, is that the scales you're using will depend on the maturity of the organization. And that's not to say that more mature organizations have to have 15-point scales, but it's more that if stakeholders are brand new to this, because you're going to work with people who are actually in those departments, right, who are actually conducting those controls on a day-to-day basis. If this is their first time ever participating in this type of assessment, likelihood and impact are going to be very new to them. And they sound easy, but when we're asking the stakeholders to think about them in terms of fraud risk, right? They're not fraud risk experts. It's going to require more education. So in that case, a simpler scale may be better as you start out and can grow more complex as you determine your needs over time. And by your needs, I mean, how differentiated do we need these risk scores to be at the end of the day? And are the risk scores getting us the information we need to make decisions? So those are really the two ways to think about it. I'd also say that some organizations already have scales in place for enterprise risk management, for example. If that's the case, consider if you can just use those, right? Again, no need to reinvent the wheel. However, there is some considerations when you do that. I've run into instances where the likelihood and impact scales that enterprise risk management had in place were not relevant for fraud risk. For example, some fraud risks are likely to occur over 100 times a year, right? For certain types of industries, think of like a financial institution. They are probably gonna have hundreds of events of account fraud. And the impact may not be high, the likelihood's high, and the ERM or the enterprise risk management scale only allowed for up to 5 occurrences per year, right? So it kind of skewed the results. So that's just a consideration when you're looking at this at an organization. And thinking about complexity, right? Here's a good example. So 1 through 3, and then here I think we have about an 8-point scale. So you can see they can be very simple or very complex, and I would just say there's not a right answer. This is one of those parts of fraud risk assessment that really is more of an art than a science. You need to figure out what works best for the organization that you're assisting or supporting. And when we think about, right, I mentioned inherent risk or pre-control and residual risk, considering controls. So that gets to inherent residual risk here. And so this is something that organizations can do. You don't have to do this. It is great to understand, right, what that pre-control risk is, or to even approach risk identification from an inherent perspective, right? That way we're not closed off and thinking, well, we have a control for that, so don't even put that in the fraud risk map, right? So I always recommend approaching the fraud risk identification process from an inherent perspective. Whether or not you decide to score each risk or rate each risk from an inherent and residual perspective is totally up to the organization. It's considered best practice, but for some organizations, it's just not necessary. So I would say in my experience, about half of the time we do this and the other half we don't. Meaning that half of the time we just focus on residual. But what do these mean, right? So inherent risk is that a risk to an entity in the absence of all controls. And residual risk is the risk that remains once you consider management action. And so you can see our pictures here, right? They are rock climbers. So the rock climber in the inherent risk section has no gear. Right? And I'm not a rock climber, so I'm not sure what the gear is called, but I'm thinking no harness, right? No pick. And then in our residual risk picture, now he has a harness, now he has a pick, right? So there's less risk involved, and that's because we put in these responses, right? We've added some equipment to help reduce that risk. And it doesn't mean it's zero risk, which is why I love the rock climbing example, right? There's always going to be risk. You can't get to zero risk, but you can reduce or mitigate. A big component here again is stakeholder education. So if you do choose to use these distinctions, so likelihood and impact both from an inherent and residual perspective, it will require stakeholder education if this is the first time. Right? These are even more difficult for stakeholders who are not risk management experts, right? Risk management is not their job. And so just need to remember that you need to provide opportunity and time to educate and train stakeholders on these terms to ensure that your results are meaningful, right? We like to think of like garbage in, garbage out, right? If they have no idea what they're rating or what these terms mean, then the scores are not going to be meaningful. And so here we get back to controls. So as you score risks, right, whether you're doing it inherent and residual, right, the likelihood and impact of those scores, really when we're focused on residual here, you should identify existing anti-fraud controls and understand their effectiveness. That will help determine likelihood and impact scores and inform future risk response. So when we get to residual risk, right, and we know what controls are already in place, right? We need to understand those existing controls, how effective they are. And if you don't have formal effectiveness ratings, you can get that information right through our qualitative and quantitative assessment techniques, right? When talking to people, through workshops, through surveys, looking at data points, right? That can help provide more insight or detail. So that's an important component as well. But this again is just a reminder, don't lose controls, right? Don't let them fall to the wayside. And this is a really great way also to help stakeholders look at residual risk in an educated way. Because I see a lot of times stakeholders say, well, it's zero risk, right? What's the lowest I can rate this risk? It's like, well, you know, we did take time and these are the controls you had and they are rated ineffective. So we actually don't think it's a low risk, right? It's important to have those kind of insights and data points in your back pocket so that when you're helping stakeholders assess risks in their areas, you can help them think through it in an educated way, like mentioned. So now that we have identified our risks, we've assessed our risks, now we need to prioritize and respond to our risks. So in prioritizing risks, one way that a lot of organizations do it is by prioritizing based on likelihood and impact scores, right? And a great way is also the presence and effectiveness of related control activities. So for example, if you decide not to score the risks, right? If you don't use likelihood and impact, you can look at whether the risk has associated controls and if they're effective. And if the risk does not have associated controls or those controls are ineffective, right? That's like a highlighter, right? Highlight that risk that needs to have a risk response if it is falling above management's risk appetite. And so once we do this kind of prioritizing process, we can then aggregate and organize the risks, and we should be able to look at them in different views, right? Maybe global or geography, by department or business unit, by risk type, if we align it to strategic objective, right? So there's a lot of ways that you can kind of slice and dice that information, and that all gets back to how you organize your fraud risk map, right? So the fraud risk map, I hope you can see, is this kind of ongoing artifact that you use throughout each of these steps. And this kind of tip here is really important. So I've said this already, right? Fraud risk assessment is more of an art than a science, but an important part when we're looking at risk scoring and then leading to risk prioritization is understanding what is relatively more likely or more significant, right? Rather than perfecting a numerical score. So a lot of times I see stakeholders get stuck, well, is it a 4 or is it a 5? Or is it a 1 or is it a 2, right? And spending a lot of time and energy on that. A lot of times what I do with clients is I take, here are the 20 significant risks. How would you rank them, right? Not even thinking about inherent and residual or likelihood and impact. What do you think is more significant, right? And let's use that initial ranking to then assign scores that we think make the most sense, and ensuring that we also leverage, right, the insights we gathered through qualitative and quantitative assessment techniques. But I find that that ranking works a lot better for stakeholders who will get stuck on numerical scores. And then we help assign numerical scores, right, based on that ranking. And another great way to do that is also taking the top 10, right? Do these top 10, based on your likelihood and impact scores, make sense to you? We did that with another client, and we found that a lot of the top 10 did not make sense, right? Stakeholders were like, well, how did that end up in my top 10? And I had to be like, you put it there, right? So let's talk about why that doesn't make sense, and what do you think should have been in the top 10 and why? And if all of that has kind of a foundation, right, of logic, and we can map that back to controls and effectiveness, then we can change these rankings through changing the scoring. So just some things to keep in mind. And again, heat maps never hurt, right? So when we think about prioritizing risks, right, and then assigning different scores. So this is I think a 5-point scale, likelihood and impact, right? And you can see, so if it was rated very likely but a minor impact, that's a medium risk. And maybe we only need to respond to risks with medium high or high, right? So it's just a great way to start to think about risk response and bake in response as you're working on prioritizing. And so when thinking of risk response, there are a few things that you can do: accept, avoid, reduce, share, or a combination. So accept, when would we accept a risk? We would accept a risk if it is in line with our risk appetite, right? We may be comfortable with a certain level of loss before we want to take action, right? And a lot of times with fraud risk management, we see accept and reduce probably the most often, right? Reduce may be implementing a new control, investing in a new technology, implementing more advanced data analytics, right? So there's different actions you can generally take to help reduce risk. And then we often see accept, right? Some organizations are willing to accept a certain level of loss before they want to invest in a mitigating response. But these are just a good kind of quick, right, view of the different actions that can be taken. And I mentioned risk appetite, right? Risk tolerance. So risk appetite and risk tolerance go hand in hand. But it's a great way to determine how to respond to risks and what risks you have to respond to. And so fraud risk tolerance refers to the level of risk your organization is willing to accept, reduce, share, or avoid. And it should consider non-financial impacts as well as financial. So it's a big asterisk, right? A lot of times we see organizations focus only on financial impact when thinking of fraud. And it is very important to consider non-financial, especially since nowadays a lot of the fraud we see in headlines, right, is related to cyber fraud. And it may not have a direct money was taken out of the company, but it can lead down the line to loss if there's loss of customers due to reputational impacts. And so you can see in this chart here, right, it gets back to impact and likelihood, and you can see once we get to kind of a 5 and 5, we need to avoid, kind of in that 3 to 4 range, reduce or share, and we're accepting everything in that 1 to 2 range, right? So it's important to, if you think of back to our heat map, right, this is where you can then assign these different risk responses based on the likelihood and impact scores. And we have a tip here, I've said it already, but it's great to mention again. You will not get to 0 risk, and that's okay. This process should help you and the organization you're supporting identify that optimal amount of risk, right? What is that right level of risk for us? What are we comfortable with? Here's another example of a heat map, but this has risk response baked into it. So you can see, right, that moderate, now we have management involvement required, extensive management crucial, maybe management involvement useful but not required, right? So this helps get to how do we need to respond to these risks. And it's important to have a consistent process for response in place so that every part of your organization is approaching fraud in the same way. So even though their risks may differ, you know that everyone's responding to moderate and significant risks, right? So you know that overall that risk profile should be reducing. Okay, so we've covered our first 3 steps, so we're going to cover our last step, right? So we've done all of this work. We've identified fraud risks, we've assessed them using qualitative and quantitative techniques, and then we assigned likelihood and impact scores. Maybe we also did that from an inherent and residual basis. We then prioritized those risks, leveraging those scores or results of control testing. We then implemented or identified risk response strategies based on that scoring. And now we have to report and document the results. So fraud risk profiles, right? So there are 2 types of reporting and documentation that you should expect to come out of a fraud risk assessment. One is the fraud risk profile, and secondly would be the summary report. The fraud risk profile is kind of what it sounds like, right? It is a profile of fraud risk for a particular area. So in our example before, we were working with an organization who had 10 departments. Each department should have its own fraud risk profile, right? And then some of the things that we recommend including, right, the key fraud risks for that department, the associated likelihood and impact scores and prioritization of those risks, the recommended risk response strategies and any recommendations to implement those strategies, right? So if we say extensive management involvement is crucial, what do we think needs to happen, right? Do we recommend enhancing and control, automating a process, right? Implementing data analytics, what is that we are recommending? And then a plan, right? So we are recommending a mitigating response. How do we know it worked, right? So that gets to monitoring. That's where we are recommending something, the business unit or department is responsible for implementation, and then we need to ensure that there is some kind of monitoring to track progress of implementation. And then once implemented, did it work like we thought? And if it didn't work like we thought, what can we do now to help reduce that risk to the acceptable level that we've established through our fraud risk tolerance and fraud risk appetite? And so all of these are great components to include in a fraud risk profile, but I will mention that these are also an art, not a science. So I've developed many of these for different organizations, and they've all looked a little bit different. But they have all included what you see right here. So that's definitely a good starting place, and then tailor it or add some nuance depending on the organization that you're supporting. And then we have our summary report, right? So fraud risk profiles are great because they give the units that you assessed tailored and specific insights. However, what about the board, right? Or the CEO or the senior leadership group? they need a report as well. And so this is where we think of a summary report. A summary report, you may have more than one version. So I've worked with organizations who we developed a summary report for their board of directors. And then we also developed a different version of the summary report for their entire organization that they could access on their intranet, right? So whatever you include in the report or the number of different reports you have will differ based on the organization. But just ensure that you do tailor the report for your intended audience, right? So you can imagine the board of directors needed much different information in that example than the entire organization did, right? The entire organization, we really focused on, here are the high level results and really what's your role in helping achieve our fraud risk tolerance levels, right? How can you help fraud risk management? And giving insight into trends and things to stay on the lookout for. For senior leadership, we said, here are the top 10 risks that you need to know about, and here's what we're doing to help reduce that risk, and here's our monitoring plan, right? So focusing on those actions that are being taken and ensuring that the board stays informed on top risks and mitigating strategies. Overall though, right, it's reporting on those key outcomes to ensure that fraud risk assessment is used as intended, and that's as a decision-making tool that can really help provide insight into why we're managing risks the way we are, if we're focusing on resources, our limited resources where they'll have the biggest impact and our highest priority items, right? And it also ensures that we incorporate those insights into our current landscape, right? So we can really improve our processes and controls in an educated way. And with that, just a few summary and closing remarks, and then we will get to some time for questions. So I'm not going to walk through each of these, but as a resource for all of you, as you develop a methodology and conduct a fraud risk assessment, these are some key questions that you can ask the organization you're supporting. So maybe you're going to be on the team doing this, maybe you're going to be supporting in a consulting role like I do, whatever that looks like. These are really good questions to ask to get a discussion going and ensure that you are tailoring the methodology appropriately for the organization. You can also find these in the beginning. The anti-fraud playbook was mentioned. So I was the lead author of the anti-fraud playbook, which helps operationalize guidance set forth. And it has an entire play on fraud risk assessment and actually an entire play on thinking like a fraudster. But these are pulled from that, and so you can access that anytime on the playbook. And I'm happy to provide a link for that if anyone needs it. It's free, you can download it, and then it's yours. But an example here, we'll just look at this first question. Who will be on your fraud risk assessment team, and what are their roles and responsibilities? Right, so the first hurdle is, who owns this? Who's championing this? Who's running with this, right? And what does that team look like? And what is everyone's roles, right? Maybe there's a leader and some team members, maybe they're all equal and they're just kind of running with this. So it really just needs to be something that's thought through. I've worked with organizations of all shapes and sizes, and each fraud risk assessment team has looked different. In one case, it was a team of 3 who were all senior leaders at the organization and were charged with running with this, and they brought us in to help execute. I've worked with organizations who have an entire dedicated fraud risk management team, right? And we were brought in more as an expert to provide guidance on how to conduct more effective fraud risk assessments. So there's not a right answer, but it's important to make sure that you have clarity on that before you get started. And even the second question here, where do you want to start your fraud risk assessment? Not every organization can conduct an enterprise-wide fraud risk assessment right off the bat, right? I've conducted risk assessments for, federal agencies with 85 programs, or, insurers with 60 programs, or I've also conducted assessments for one department, right? We came in and helped develop a methodology, and we conducted an assessment in one area because that's where the organization had resources and how they were able to start, right? So, and that's okay. But it's important to think about that and how much you can really tackle all at once or at the get-go. And then here, a checklist, right? So this is, again, how do we get from point A to point B, and things to consider. So we talked through all of this already, but just a good reminder of all of the different steps that we went through today. And with that, I think I've left about 10 minutes for questions, so I welcome any right now. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. so I can see if you guys have put questions in the chat.
All right, ma'am. We have some questions that are coming from Facebook as well as YouTube. So the first question is about whistleblowers. So how do you sort of like, because whistleblowers are taken to be it's something very difficult for people to do, because once they do that and it comes out in the market, it's very difficult for them to sort of be in the organization or elsewhere. So how do you persuade someone to become a whistleblower, to tell you guys about the various, frauds that could happen? Would be easier to say, but that is already happened and has come into their notice. So what is the ways to persuade such people to come out and tell us about the risks?
Yeah, I mean, encouraging whistleblowers is all about culture, right? So that gets back to having a culture where people don't fear retaliation, where they feel comfortable seeing something and saying something. And then the organization has to follow through on that culture once the whistle is blown, right? So it's more about just saying it, and people have to see that that's happening consistently. And it can happen on a smaller scale, right? So I've worked with organizations where they just had tips come in from employees who thought something was a little fishy, and those employees didn't get any support, right? They didn't feel their complaint or allegation was handled properly. And so they never called again and encouraged other peers not to bother, right? So it can even be for smaller incidents, but you need to make sure that all of those types of tips are handled appropriately, that your culture is set up to be conducive to tips and whistleblower complaints, and that once those things happen, there is a perception that they're handled appropriately. And even if investigative teams feel they are, perception's everything, right? So if the people who are actually going to be calling in don't feel that it is being handled well, then you need to figure out where that disconnect may be. So I think it all goes back to those elements.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is about that, given that the digital era is sort of evolving, it makes it even more difficult for us, because the frauds that are happening are very, very complex in nature now. That's happening because, or like you mentioned, the cyber-related frauds that are evolving and, happening at a major scale. So what do you think is the major hurdle for a risk assessment associate when they're doing a fraud risk assessment when it comes to dealing with such risks?
I think it's about expertise. So a lot of times fraud risk professionals are not cyber professionals, right? And so it's making sure that if you are performing a fraud risk assessment and you are not a cyber professional, that you bring in expertise that can help think through what those schemes may be where cyber and fraud emerge. Like they kind of come together, right? And so what are the things that we're experiencing? How do we be on the lookout for that? And we also recommend, as part of a fraud risk assessment, to do a cyber hygiene check. So making sure that our cyber defenses, when we think about cyber fraud, are also working effectively. And if not, how can we bake that into our fraud reporting and recommendations? But I think it's all about expertise and leveraging what expertise is already at the organization or in your own networks.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. There's Michael who would like to ask a question.
Sure.
Michael, you can start your camera and mic.
Okay, thank you so much. Ma'am, I want to ask, you might be in an organization and working as a fraud examiner. The organization is about to introduce a new product line, but you are not given the opportunity to maybe do the fraud assessment, fraud risk assessment, right? But you know that in the near future, your job will be that product, a line which is about to be introduced to be part and parcel of your scope of your job. How best can we deal with that situation as a professional?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's also something that even as like a consultant who's brought in to help, we get pushback, right? We get pushback from stakeholders who are trying to get a product to market, and they're not interested in taking a week or a month to take a pause and ensure that risks have been considered. I recently worked with a financial institution who pushed out a product quickly and then was fraught with fraud. right? They experienced tons of loss because it did get pushed out without fraud risk considerations. So I think, Michael, your question goes back to education, right? And being proactive. And if you're charged with being a certified fraud examiner, you can add value outside of your specific role by recommending best practice. And if you don't take you up on that, right, you've done your job, right? You've done your duty at least to push that out there and start that education process. But it can even be a 2-hour session just to think through, right? Have we considered all of the potential risks that this product may create? Not that we're not going to push out the product anyway, but are we comfortable with that risk, or are we going to put in appropriate mitigating actions on the front end, right? We get back to crisis prevention rather than cleanup, right? So I think it can be a lot of education, and you may not be successful the first try, but over time, I think education has worked well in my experience.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Another question that we have is regarding prioritizing risks. So when you're sitting to sort of prioritize risks, let's say all the shareholders or stakeholders that are sitting there in that particular meeting, how do you come to a consensus, when it comes to prioritizing those risks? Because person A might have certain other comments regarding that priorities that you must have set up. So how do you tackle such problems that you face?
Yeah, that's a great question. So generally what I do is we conduct a pre-workshop survey. So I mentioned that I think a best-in-class fraud risk assessment has those targeted interviews followed by a cross-functional workshop. Before that workshop, I generally recommend sending out a survey to ask individuals that plan to attend to rank schemes, right? Getting that to ranking versus focusing on scoring. And then leveraging the workshop to get on the same page. Do we feel this ranking is appropriate? And then having that discussion to ensure that everyone has the benefit of each other's perspectives, because some individuals may have more background on that particular risk based on their role at the organization than others. And so we then conduct a post-workshop survey, right? Now that you've all heard this discussion, we've had it live, would you change your ranking? And we generally leverage then that post-workshop survey result to assign likelihood and impact scores based on the discussion and post-workshop survey rankings. So you may never get to a complete consensus, and that's okay. Everyone has different perspectives, right? And that crosses the boundaries of risk scoring too. And so the key here is to make sure that we're focused on, does the ranking make sense? Not the score, right? Does the ranking make sense? And if we're comfortable with that, then the scores will follow.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. There's one of the students, Mrinal, he has a question as to how to conduct fraud risk assessment in an organization where there is no qualitative and quantitative data available, such as like ransomware, bitcoins related frauds, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. If the organization itself doesn't have data on this, there is a lot of data externally, right? There's a lot of resources available, easily accessed on the web, right? There's a lot of experts out there that you can also contact. I'm not shy when it comes to contacting people who are experts in their fields when I have a question, right? We can't be experts in everything. And so when we're thinking about things like ransomware and Bitcoin related frauds, this can be very complex. And if your organization doesn't have the data to help assess that risk, look externally to see what resources are out there. I was just reading the other day about a checklist to prevent ransomware, right? And so I could easily take that checklist to a client and say, do we check these boxes? And if not, those are some easy things we can circle that we need to work on, and we can start to build a better risk mitigation approach. So I think look externally. There's so many experts out there and so much information available. Don't let it all go to waste.
All right, thank you so much, ma'am. I think that was the last question that we had for this evening. Over to you, Hari, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Miss Sophia, I have gone through your whole session, and to be honestly, till last session, the type of sessions we have organized were much focused on, the introduction to forensic accounting, fraud and fraud analysis, and rest of the part which we had scheduled was we had scheduled a workshop on Microsoft Power BI also, which related to presentation of the data. Besides, we also schedule the workshop, the sessions on data analytics part also. But the mid pinpoint which was missing was of the fraud risk analysis, and we were not focused on a qualitative data analysis. The right question asked by one of our students, Mrinal, is what kind of analysis to be performed in terms of qualitative data and quantitative data. So we have much focused on the quantitative part till now, but we couldn't focus on the qualitative part. So that's why we have scheduled the session, and we had requested you to share your expertise with the students in terms of fraud risk assessment. And rightly, and to be honestly, I'm telling you, the session is going through an excellent way. And the way you had discussed, because there are some learning points from me also. I was noting down the points which you had discussed, which were more focused on the risk assessment part from qualitative perspective. So that was an extraordinary session, and I'm damn sure that students have learned a lot from different perspective as far as forensic accounting and fraud investigation is concerned. So the gap is filled up now, and it is just a commencement of it, because we were focused on the basics, theories, we were focused on the data analytics. Even data analytics part has not been yet start for the students. It is yet to come. But the middle point which was missing about the gap filling, fraud risk assessment, why to do and how to do, that question has been answered properly in this session. Sophia, official vote of thanks would be given by Professor Arya, but just thank you for sharing your valuable time, and thanks because we were having the discussion since October, and today we got your time, and finally it is done. Thanks a lot for your valuable time. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. Over to you, Professor Arya.
On behalf of National Forensic Sciences University School of Management Studies, I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to you, ma'am. We as an institute, it is easy for us to give the theoretical knowledge that the students require when they venture into the corporate side, but the technical aspects as well as the practical side of things is something that we cannot provide them, in a better way. So, as an industry expert, and given the webinar that you have, given for us, or the session that you have conducted, I feel like all the students have now got a basic understanding about what risk assessment is, and they also know how it works in the corporate side, because they know what it is in the theoretical aspect, but they have never understood how to do this in a corporate setting. And I think you have given us, a really wonderful webinar as to how this is done in a corporate setting. So I would like to give my sincere gratitude to you for giving us such a wonderful session. And we hope to have more such associations with you in the future as well. With this, I think we can conclude our webinar for today. And we thank you sincerely for your time and your efforts.
Thank you so much. Again, it was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. And if anyone does have questions, I have my contact. Feel free to reach out. I'm happy to continue to discuss if you do have anything that you want to ask. Thank you again.
Yeah, definitely we will have, we'll be in touch with you, and we will definitely have a few more sessions on a different topic, and in-depth topic on a particular, a point of discussion we will definitely have. Thank you, Ms. Sophia.
Sounds great.
For accepting our invitation. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, students.